Hello, thank you so much everyone for taking the time to watch this video. My name is Jessica Serrano-Seipel. I'm a Senior Program Director with Just Detention International. Today's video is a first in a series of trainings, and this one's going to focus on sexual abuse in detention, the basics. Our agenda for this video is to just do a welcome, and we'll talk a little more about some of the other trainings that we'll be doing. We'll talk a bit about just the big picture of incarceration in the United States, some of the dynamics of sexual abuse in detention, particularly how it's different than sexual abuse in the community. We'll talk about the PREA Standards, and also some of the basic frameworks for serving incarcerated survivors. We are going to focus on Pennsylvania for a bit, just so that it feels really relevant to everyone listening. I know you all are the experts on this, but I do just want to reiterate to please take care of yourselves. This video, we're going to be talking about sexual abuse. We're going to be talking about violence and oppression. So if you need to pause or take a glass of water or whatever, please do so. For anyone who isn't familiar with JDI, we are a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. And we do that work in a few ways. We work with corrections officials, rape crisis advocates, such as everyone listening, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe. We promote public attitudes that value the dignity and safety of people in detention. And then we also support incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse and sexual harassment directly. The fundamental principle behind JDI's work is that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to keep that person safe, and that no matter what crime someone may have committed, that rape is never part of that penalty. As I mentioned earlier, this is a series of trainings starting with this video. We're also going to be hosting a couple live training sessions. The dates are here on September 22nd. We'll focus on some of the important best practices if you're trying to build sustainable relationships with local correctional facilities, in particular jails. And then on the 29th, we'll do a deep dive into some of the best practices on actually providing different services to incarcerated survivors. So things like letter writing, hotline, forensic exams, and even in-person services. We'll sort of pick those apart and talk about some of those best practices. I think we all know that language, that words have a lot of power. And I just want to indicate that we are going to be using these two terms here, person who is incarcerated, and that's instead of the word inmate, instead of the word offender. And we're also going to use the word survivor instead of the word victim. And I encourage you to, also consider using that language if you're not already. So, you may be wondering why we're taking this time to talk about and to learn more about working with survivors who are in detention. As rape crisis advocates, you all are tasked with providing support to survivors in your community, right? And survivors who are behind bars are part of our communities. However, they are among the most marginalized in our communities. Incarcerated people are far more likely to be people of color, people living in poverty, and people who have experienced sexual violence before. And they deserve the same kind of help that any other survivor would get if they reached out to their local rape crisis center. We'll start with a quote from a sexual abuse survivor. Her name is Joanna. She is a member of our Survivor Council. She's also part of JDI staff right now, and she was assaulted while she was incarcerated. She said, "The assault wasn't my fault, and just because I was incarcerated, I did not deserve to be raped." Revisiting the core principle that I mentioned earlier, again, just want to reemphasize, it doesn't matter what someone has done or what identities they hold. No one deserves to be sexually assaulted. And that's a principle that as advocates, we really hold dear. And it's important to make sure that we are also including incarcerated survivors in that work as well. So let's talk a little bit just about sort of the big picture view of what incarceration in the United States looks like and where people are incarcerated. There isn't really one criminal justice system, although we often refer to it as a singular entity. There are thousands of federal, state, local, county or city, and tribal systems. And there are variations in how those facilities are run. Of course, the common thread is that people are not free to leave when they're held in them. And there can sometimes be a lot of confusion about the different kinds of facilities, and what makes them different from each other. And so I'm going to break down that a little bit. And of course, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, I think the differences between jails and prisons tend to get the most confusing for folks. And so jail stays are typically shorter, usually less than a year. Typically, jails are operated at the local level, so by the city or the county. And jails are usually where people are held sometimes before they even are tried, right? So we have people that have not yet been convicted of a crime, and they are in jail because they cannot afford to post bail. There is an overwhelming number of facilities in the United States. Together, these systems hold almost 2 million people in about 1,566 state prisons, 102 federal prisons, 2,850 local jails, 1,510 juvenile correctional facilities, 186 immigration detention facilities, 82 Indian country jails, as well as military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in U.S. territories as well, right? And so if jails are where folks go before they're tried or for very short stays, prisons are often where people are then sentenced. So they may be transferred to a prison to live for several years, up to life sentences. And that's really the biggest difference between a jail and a prison. There's also, a really huge misconception about why people are locked up, right? And we know that most people are incarcerated because of nonviolent drug offenses. Over 400,000 people sitting in jails across the country have not been convicted yet. And again, in many cases, they're there because they can't afford bail. Looking closely at Pennsylvania, and this data is from 2018, there were 96,000 people incarcerated in Pennsylvania at that time. And the number of people impacted by the county and city jails is probably a lot larger, actually, than what's in this this pie chart here. It's a snapshot in time, right? And people, one of the things that is just natural to jails is that people come in and out really, really quickly. People might be there for a few days, a few weeks, and they're coming in and out, going back to the community. So that number can fluctuate really dramatically. Each year, approximately 170,000 different people are booked into local jails in Pennsylvania. Another really important piece to have a good understanding of the state of incarceration in the United States is there are enormous racial disparities in terms of who is locked up in detention facilities. Folks of color are greatly overrepresented in detention settings. Particularly Black people are more likely to be arrested and more likely to be held in jails and sentenced to longer prison times than their white peers. Similarly, in our jails and prisons as well, there is an overrepresentation of people living with serious mental illness. This is a vital connection to think about, right, when we're talking about the dynamics between racism, mental health, and mass incarceration. Most incarcerated people have a history of complex trauma. For example, these are folks that have experienced sexual and/or physical abuse as children, sexual assault as adults, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, gang violence, and police violence. In fact, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is where most of our data on this comes from, people who are incarcerated are twice as likely to be survivors of previous sexual assault and domestic violence and/or child abuse than those who are not incarcerated. So when you're working with someone who is incarcerated, the focus on your support, may very well be about past traumas and not something that may have happened inside the facility. We have found, at JDI through our work that many survivors reach out to us looking for help related to childhood sexual abuse, right? People who are incarcerated have also often faced extreme poverty and have very limited access to resources. The kinds of resources that you may offer to folks that reach out to you in the community may be inaccessible. I think the other thing that's really important to talk about, regarding detention is the trauma of detention itself. So regardless of previous trauma that may have been experienced or abuse that may occur inside, just the experience of being incarcerated is in and of itself really traumatizing. Detention environments are often incredibly oppressive spaces, and even the things that don't legally constitute abuse can be really traumatizing, right? So things like constant surveillance, the lack of privacy, even if pat searches or strip searches are done appropriately and to policy, it can still be really, really triggering. The daily humiliation of having insufficient access to hygiene items, all of this contributes to a really harmful environment for a lot of people. That can be really unsafe, right? This has been, I think, made even more clear during the pandemic, where people inside prisons and jails, have died as a result of COVID-19 and continue to face unsafe conditions, whether that's, no masking or, a lack of soap, kind of basic hygiene products. I think, there's also a misconception that, mental health services are really robust in detention facilities, especially considering how many people incarcerated have mental health issues. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There's very minimal, if any, mental health services that are available in the vast majority of detention facilities. And the services that are available are typically incredibly limited, difficult to access. They require a diagnosis. They almost never look like the kind of weekly, trauma therapy sessions that we may think of when we think of mental health services. They so frequently include just a symptom check, a medication check, a very quick, are you feeling suicidal? Those kinds of really basic screening questions, and that's it. So no opportunities to really talk about and process traumatic experiences. So now that we've sort of talked a little bit about some of the basics of incarceration overall, let's talk about sexual abuse in detention facilities, how it's similar to abuse that happens in the community and how it differs. When it comes to sexual abuse in detention, a frequent question is often, how often does that really happen, right? And we know that one time is too many, right? And we know that it has happened far too often. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which I mentioned earlier, roughly 200,000 people are sexually abused in US prisons and jails each year. To put this into perspective, this is approximately the population of Richmond, Virginia, right? A major US city. Note that this figure represents the number of people, not the number of incidents, right? So we have often, talked with folks that have experienced multiple incidents of abuse. Many of these 200,000 people are abused more than once, as I mentioned, and many more experience various forms of sexual harassment that would not be considered sexual abuse. In one survey, 1 in 10 formerly incarcerated people, adults specifically, reported being sexually abused while in detention. I'm going to play a really quick video here, so let me just take one moment to cue that up.
In progress.
All right, so before we get into some of the more details of the dynamics of sexual abuse behind bars, I want to share a video featuring Rodney, who talks about his experience behind bars and the importance of having an outside person to talk to.
I was so angry with myself because I felt like I didn't fight back. I didn't do anything. can't look in the mirror because you're ashamed of what happened. You're ashamed of what you feel you let happen. I disassociated. The physical pain was not even a comparison to what just had happened to me. There was also a thought of that it's over. It was every time I was thinking that, oh, it's over. This is just the last. Just get over with. My goal was to get out of the entire situation. Already in prison, it's a very emotionally trying thing. Very emotionally trying. You're away from your family. You're away from a lot of things. But this going through prison and being raped is even more isolating. So you can't talk to anyone. In some of the places that I've been, the counselors, and they're not trained for this. They're not trained to understand this. They're trained for pretty much suicide prevention. In the state, I saw a counselor once that wanted to know what my plan was when I left home. So the more focus is getting back out and getting yourself together. So who do you talk to? Initially, I wrote JDI a 13-page letter, and they responded with a lot of information for me. The information let me know, look, there are places to help you in this world, and here are some of them. We are also one from just my first time writing JDI up until today has always been that therapy, just having someone to listen to what I rant about and how I feel about what's going on, what's went on. It isn't your fault. You're not the only one that happens to, and we understand. Sometimes even still today, I blame myself for this. Sometimes, and so to hear someone constantly tell you, you need that reminder, because if you're dealing with it yourself, you know, I'm a step from the ledge. No one deserves this. No one deserves for their body, their mind, their sexuality. No one deserves that to be ripped from them because they committed a crime.
So take a moment just to think about everything that Rodney said. I think what really stands out to me is just the power of the work that you all as advocates do every single day. And what a difference just some kind words can make, some validation, some reminders that, it's not your fault. Those things can be really, really powerful, especially for, someone who was in Rodney's position, who had no one else telling him those things, right? No one else to listen to him. And that's something that you all do every day and that you can do for incarcerated survivors as well. So let's discuss some of the dynamics of sexual abuse in detention. As with the community, it exists on a spectrum. There's a continuum of violence, right? Sexual harassment is absolutely a type of sexual violence. And, as advocates, we provide survivors or provide support to survivors who have experienced any of that range of victimization. Sexual harassment tends to be where abuse in detention starts, right? Some of that boundary pushing to see, how far someone can get. And those dynamics are very similar to what we see on the outside. Now, protective pairing is something that is fairly unique to sexual abuse in detention. That is a situation where someone promises to protect someone else from violence, and in return, that person is forced to perform sexual acts on them or with others. This often becomes a situation where someone is sold into sex in the facility, which is very similar to human trafficking, right? Sex trafficking that we see in the community. Now, the thing about this type of abuse in detention is that it's very easy to the untrained eye for it to appear consensual, right? a good gauge to use to measure a survivor's sort of willingness and whether that consent is sincere is to ask, would you agree to do this on the outside, right? If you were not in detention right now, would you agree to do this? And people more often than not will say no, right? And that's a good indicator that what's happening is not okay and not consensual. Common methods that perpetrators of sexual abuse behind bars will use to gain, compliance from a target is offers of protection, as I mentioned before, obviously threats, coercion, particularly with staff abuse. We see a lot of abuse of authority, extortion, medications, drugs, contraband, these kinds of things, and of course, force as well. This is often surprising to a lot of folks, but in adult facilities, staff are equally as likely to be the perpetrators of sexual abuse as other incarcerated people, right? And so often, the stereotype is that incarcerated people are more likely to be victimized by other incarcerated people, and that's just not the case. In juvenile facilities, that dynamic is very different. Over 82% of victimized youth were abused by staff, right? And I do want to point out that when we talk about staff here, we're not just talking about security or uniform staff, right? We're talking about contractors, such as people that work in food service, right? Mental health workers, medical staff, maintenance people, education, programming people, administration, volunteers, basically anyone that gets to leave at the end of the day, right, is considered a staff person. And it's important to have a really good understanding that there is no such thing as consensual sex between an incarcerated person and a staff member. No matter what the dynamics are, no matter what the circumstances are, it is always considered sexual abuse. And that's just because staff have a lot of power over incarcerated people, regardless of the age of the person, right? Every aspect of an incarcerated person's life is controlled by staff, right? And that includes when someone can go to programming, what they eat, whether they have visits, whether they're written up for infractions or disciplinary, that kind of stuff. And so for that reason, along with others, staff consent between incarcerated people and staff is just not possible. There are, various individuals that are at an increased risk of sexual victimization, similar to what we see in the community. People who are perceived to be unable to protect themselves or are perceived to be unlikely to be believed or unlikely to be taken seriously are more likely to be targeted. So that includes people with cognitive, intellectual, and physical disabilities, people who have mental illness, LGBTQI+ people, and people who have experienced sexual abuse in the past. People with cognitive or intellectual or physical disabilities are 3 times more likely to be sexually abused than other people. Those who have been previously victimized, as you can see here, are 6 times more likely. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, 6 times more, a little more than 6 times more likely. And then transgender people are at the highest risk of sexual abuse in detention. They're almost 8 times more likely to be abused while in detention. And despite, a bulk of research that says that transgender women are at a great risk when they're housed with cisgender men, Cecilia, whose photo is here, was held in a jail for men, and like many other transgender women, was raped by another incarcerated person who was in her housing unit. And she said, "Although you may think that I'm not like you, we may not be so different. I want to have control over my own body and my life, just as you do. I absolutely did not want to have sex with that man in that jail, but I felt powerless to refuse him." And I imagine that echoes what a lot of other survivors that you've worked with previously have said. Some of the really intense challenges to healing, that incarcerated survivors face can be really overwhelming, right? There's always challenges to healing, but incarcerated people just experience some that are very unique to their setting. We often hear from survivors that we work with that they feel alone and they don't know where to turn for help. People, may theoretically have access to mental health care, as I mentioned earlier. That may be like just a brief visit, sometimes at a cell door once a month, to check medication and side effects and that, but not to really dissect or to process trauma. Survivors may often not trust facility mental health staff. It's important to remember, even though they're not uniformed security staff, they are a part of that system, right? And there can be a lot of distrust on the confidentiality of, what those services would look like. We have heard from people that they've found facility mental health staff really helpful. So that's not, something across the board for sure. But the key here is that it can't be assumed, right, that someone can talk to mental health safely. Medical care, similarly, may also be really limited, right? And there are some facilities where medical care has a copay and a cost, right? So that may be an additional barrier. People who are incarcerated can't just request a different housing change for no reason, right? And even if they have a reason, they may not, that may not be granted. They can't just go somewhere else if they feel unsafe, right? So that means that they may not be able to get away from a perpetrator, and that abuse may be ongoing. This is especially true if the perpetrator is a staff member, right? That's someone that they're going to see every day. While many survivors have trouble being believed when they speak out about their abuse, this is doubly true, right? For people who are incarcerated. We see facility staff often, making reports. They view those reports as someone trying to make trouble, someone trying to get back at somebody, someone, lashing out, and, will fail to take reports seriously, right? We will talk about the specifics of PREA in a little bit, but retaliation is something that is a huge concern for incarcerated survivors. Retaliation is specifically not allowed. It's not acceptable, but it is unfortunately the reality that so many incarcerated survivors face. And then, of course, detention settings just in and of themselves are very triggering. There's no privacy, very little autonomy. It's dehumanizing. And that makes some of the basic challenges to healing really difficult. So things like, how loud your surroundings are, whether the lights are on and off, those kinds of things, access to reading materials that are really, really difficult for incarcerated people. All right, so I mentioned we would talk about PREA, which stands for the Prison Rape Elimination Act. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. So PREA is a federal statute that requires correctional facilities to take concrete steps to protect people from sexual abuse, right? There are a number of prison and jail PREA standards, and each standard has several provisions underneath it. So there's a lot of things that that facilities are required to do. We will not be able to go over every single one of them in detail. It is pretty extensive. We'll go over just some of the basics, particularly those that are really relevant to your work as advocates. It's important to just know that the PREA standards affirm that it is the absolute responsibility of corrections agencies to protect people from sexual abuse. And at the same time, they really recognize how important outside organizations are to doing that work. So the intention of the standards obviously is to keep people safe, right? That's the primary focus. The PREA standards require correctional facilities, as I mentioned, to take steps to protect survivors from people who have abused them, to provide multiple ways to report sexual abuse and sexual harassment, to give survivors access to appropriate emergency and ongoing medical and mental health care at no cost, to increase staff and agency accountability, and to provide access to rape crisis services that are at the same level of care as a survivor in the community might receive. And that is, of course, where you all as advocates come in. And as I mentioned, there are many, many standards, that are important, but we will focus primarily on the ones that are relevant to your work. One area of confusion that often comes up, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, is what constitutes sort of a PREA violation or a sexual abuse issue versus a rule violation. And so, just to backtrack slightly, consensual sex between incarcerated people happens in detention, and it is across the board against the rules, right? It is against the rules of facilities to have sexual contact, right? And staff often struggle to differentiate what is a PREA sexual abuse and what is consensual sex, right? And that can be really confusing for a lot of staff. When incarcerated people have consensual sex with each other, it is not sexual abuse, it is not a PREA incident, and it is not a crime, right? It's a rule violation. So there may often be discipline for that, but no one should be charged with a crime. However, if there's no consent, obviously it is sexual abuse. It is a PREA violation. It is against the law. And it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to just reiterate that consensual sex between staff and incarcerated people can never happen. So if staff are engaging sexually with incarcerated people, that is always going to be a crime. It's always going to be a PREA violation. So as I mentioned earlier, PREA is really lengthy, it's really complicated. The PREA standards, which are available online, and if you'd like to read through them, you most certainly can. It's important to know that they provide, as I mentioned, detailed guidelines on preventing, detecting, and responding to sexual abuse. Those are the three sort of keywords, if you will. They apply to all corrections facilities. So there's a different set of standards for prisons and jails, as you can see here in the image. There's a separate set of standards for juvenile facilities, and there's a separate set of standards for community confinement facilities and lockup facilities. So lockup facilities is where someone might go, overnight while they're being transferred to a jail, for example. And the standards are different for each type of facility because each type of facility is so different in and of itself. Now, again, we're not going to mention every single one of those standards here, but there are a few just sort of important points to note. The PREA standards are not binding on rape crisis centers. So in other words, they do not require you as advocates or rape crisis entities to do anything, right? It is the responsibility of corrections agencies to be compliant with the PREA standards. One of the standards that most commonly impacts advocates is that corrections agencies are required to, quote unquote, attempt to establish an MOU with a local rape crisis center. So you may have been contacted by a jail or prison to do just that. So one of the important standards that I mentioned earlier is that the facility must provide survivors of sexual abuse with multiple ways to report, including anonymously, right? And so that can be a real challenge for a lot of survivors to figure out how to do that. A lot of facilities don't necessarily have good systems for anonymous reports specifically. This looks very different, right, than in the community where a survivor goes to law enforcement to make a report, right? The PREA standards mandate that a survivor must be able to report to any staff person, any contractor, any volunteer at the facility. And every staff person, volunteer, or contractor in a facility is going to be a mandated reporter. So they are required to report any incidents of sexual abuse or sexual harassment that they're made aware of. Survivors can also report in writing, either through a formal grievance process or even just a note slipped under a door or something like that. Third parties are also able to report sexual abuse and sexual harassment on behalf of incarcerated people. That's very different than in the community. So a third party could be a friend, family member, an attorney, a loved one, someone on the outside who can report on behalf of somebody. Now, where this can often get confusing is, you all as rape crisis centers are not considered third parties. You're also not considered an outside reporting entity, or at least it's not best practice that you are considered an outside reporting entity. So facilities are required to provide some sort of way to report that is outside of the facility. So this could be like a Crime Stoppers hotline or Office of Inspector General, or some sort of outside agency that fields reports and forwards them to the facility. That's not something that we recommend rape crisis centers do. It can make those sort of lines really blurred around confidentiality in particular. For the Pennsylvania Department of Correction Prisons, for example, their outside reporting entity is the Office of State Inspector General, right? So incarcerated survivors can write to them to make a report, right? And every jail, every prison is required to have that entity. And as I mentioned, verbally and in writing as well. So we know that PREA has hugely helped to protect survivors and provide ways for them to report, but much like in the community, survivors overwhelmingly do not report sexual abuse in detention, regardless of how many ways there are available to make a report. As you can see here, 200,000 people were sexually abused in detention in 2011. Of that, a little less than 8,800 were reported, and of that, only 902 were substantiated. So substantiated means that it was determined that abuse took place, right? It doesn't mean that there was any sort of accountability. It doesn't say anything about any follow-up that was done. It just means that an investigation was done and it was found to have occurred, right? And as I mentioned earlier, we see this in the community as well. There's similar infographics that look just like this that have similar numbers for community survivors. So that dynamic of not feeling safe reporting and there not being really meaningful follow-up exists in detention as well. And one of the particular dynamics of detention that makes this so relevant is if someone is reporting sexual abuse by a staff person, they're reporting that to staff people, to their abuser's colleagues, right? So there are serious concerns about perceived lack of credibility on behalf of incarcerated survivors, that staff aren't going to see them credible, and that staff will cover for each other, right? That's a huge concern as well. I mentioned earlier that one of the PREA standards talks about access to medical and mental health care. So even though we've discussed how poor some of the medical or mental health care can be in detention, it's important to at least have an understanding of what it's supposed to look like, right? So under the PREA standards, any incarcerated person who reports being sexually abused must be provided with timely, unimpeded access to emergency medical treatment, crisis intervention services, and ongoing medical and mental health care, right? So the standards mandate that corrections agencies provide survivors with information about and access to emergency contraception and care for possible sexually transmitted infections, if that's relevant. Survivors who might become pregnant must also be offered pregnancy tests and receive information about their right to lawful pregnancy-related medical services following an assault. I mentioned earlier that some facilities require copays for medical care. This is not allowed under the PREA standards if that care is related to sexual abuse, right? We will talk about some of the best work that you can do with a survivor regarding medical services, and particularly medical forensic exam accompaniment later in September. The part of the PREA standards that is like the most relevant to the work that you all are doing is the one that talks about access to victim services, right? So the PREA standards state that corrections agencies must attempt to make a victim advocate from an outside agency available for emotional support and a medical forensic exam and during investigatory interviews, right? So just like in the community, exam accompaniment and interview accompaniment, right? Facilities must also make emotional support services available via phone or letter to everyone in the facility in as confidential a manner as possible. So this is regardless of whether or not someone has reported abuse. This is something that must be available to everybody, right? It must be provided to all incarcerated people in the facility, whether they report abuse or not, like I just said. The facility must provide that person a medical forensic exam if appropriate within 120 hours, just like in the community. The survivor should also be able to have confidential access to your services by phone or letter, whether they report abuse, right? I think that this little infographic here can be really helpful to kind of understand, when someone has the right to a victim advocate or not, right? So under PREA, if a survivor reports abuse, the facility must provide that person a forensic exam and access to an advocate during the exam and any investigatory interviews. And that last piece is really important because it's the one that at least we've seen to be the most challenging. They should also be able to have confidential access to an advocate either by phone or letter for emotional support, right? If someone has not reported, again, they have the right to an advocate for emotional support. And that could be emotional support for abuse that took place in the facility or at any time previously in their lives. Some of the services that we've seen around the country that rape crisis centers are currently providing includes, as I mentioned, forensic exam accompaniment, hotline calls, written correspondence, in-person support, either individuals or groups, advocacy, systems advocacy, and some other special programming such as prevention education, trauma education, these kinds of things. And we'll talk a little more in detail about these various services at our second training in September. So our framework for serving survivors behind bars is important to discuss. We know that this is not easy work, right? Working with people who are incarcerated can be incredibly challenging. For some, it may be scary, particularly if you're not used to working with this population or you're not used to working inside facilities. Even if you've never worked with anyone in custody before, it's important to know that you are already an expert, right, in serving survivors. You have a wealth of experience and tools. And those same tools, that same knowledge that you are using day in, day out to help survivors in the community are the same things that you'll use to help survivors in detention. You're here because you care. And that's the primary sort of prerequisite, right, to doing this work, is that you care. And whether or not you can offer, specific resources or specific kinds of help, whether or not you can do anything is less important than just your ability to provide that validation and a listening ear. I want to play another video very briefly, so there will be a pause while I cue that up. This is from Martine, who's a formerly incarcerated person, and he talks about just how important having that outside advocate is to incarcerated people.
If a lot of things got reported the way they were, they'd realize how the system is so broken. We inmates have a code of silence, and correctional officers have a code of silence too. And sometimes that code of silence is extremely dangerous, because once that silence gets broken, a lot of people are at risk. A lot of times there's this thing where we feel we're going to get rejected, we're not going to be accepted, we're not going to be worthy of help, right? But knowing that advocates are there, their role can actually save lives. We're full of emotions. We just can't show them. In a sense, a lot of us are already broken when we're there. And I think it's important for advocates to be there, ready, willing, and realize that, you're not just dealing with a broken person, but somebody who really needs to be put back together. Take me, for example, if I was to reach out for help in there, I wouldn't know how to talk to you. I would be afraid of judgment. I'd be afraid of too many questions at one time. I'd be weary of talking to somebody who doesn't know me. And I'd also be weary of, who are you talking to? You're talking to me, but are you talking to somebody else? The advice I'd give an advocate is just kind of put some guidelines out there, who you are, what your intentions are. And if an advocate can show me their real side, not their personal side, but just who they are as a real person, then I'm more likely to open up. If I reached out or one of my peers reached out, that individual is ready to talk, and all the, a lot of times a gentle smile and a joke really does lets my exterior down a little bit. I know that a lot of advocates or people doing that work also are filled with news media and these lockup shows and stories about what we do in prison, right? And I think the more people watch those things, the less human I become. As hard as my exterior can be, there's this humanness about us, you know? Well, like I said, we're broken, and you have the skills to help us out. It's the same skills you have when working with a non-inmate. You know, I'm a human who needs help.
All right. And I gotta say, one of my favorite things about Martin's video is when he pauses and says, you know, who are you talking to, right? And I think that that really just goes to show, you know, the lack of trust that is so inherent to these detention settings, right? And how important it is for us as advocates to really work to earn that trust, which is a perfect lead into our next slide here, which is all about the empowerment model. And that's something that you're probably familiar with, maybe you've heard of, you know, used that language. It's, you know, super important when we're talking about working with incarcerated survivors. You know, one of the main sort of tenets of the empowerment model is that the survivor and not the advocate is the expert in their lives, right? That survivors know what they've been through, they know what works and what doesn't work, they know sort of what options are more realistic for them than others. And so, you know, because of that, it's important that we don't make any assumptions, right? And as I mentioned earlier, that we acknowledge that trust is not a given, that has to be earned, right? And so if you say you're going to do something, if you say you're going to write back, if you say you're going to, you know, follow up, that you do it, right? That validation is key as a part of that as well, right? That we are all about just validating what those feelings are, even if to you they don't make sense, or even if to you you think, oh, I would do something different. That we are all about sort of validating what that survivor has experienced and what their feelings are. Part of how we earn trust, right, is to be really transparent about the limits of our work, whether that's talking about limits of confidentiality, whether that's talking about what we can and cannot offer. As advocates, those are really important things to talk about right off the bat, as Martin said. You know, again, incarcerated people have experience in being failed by the system and disappointed by the system, and so it's important that we do not, you know, add ourselves to that list of systems that have failed them, right? I mentioned earlier, you know, how important confidentiality is, and it truly, truly is in a detention setting. It's so important and so challenging, right? Your agency should set up services to be as confidential as possible, and it's important that you share, again, with survivors up front, what is confidential, what isn't, what you would be required to report, what you wouldn't, et cetera, so that they can make that informed decision, right, about what to talk to you about, if at all. There may be times where you have to break confidentiality, right? So in the event that someone says that they are suicidal or they're threatening to harm someone else, you know, those may be examples when, you know, your agency policies or, you know, your local laws would require you to report. And so you want to make that clear to survivors right off the bat. Ideally, however, you would want to treat, you know, your communications with incarcerated survivors as the same as you would with someone who is not incarcerated, right? So, you know, you wouldn't share details of conversations about a survivor in the community to an attorney, for example, or to their doctor or whatever, right, without their permission. And the same is true of incarcerated survivors, right? Having that release of information is so important if you're going to be sharing any information about that survivor with someone else. And we're going to talk more in detail about confidentiality and some of those challenges in an upcoming training. But just note that confidentiality is going to be a huge challenge. It is possible to a certain extent, and there are definitely ways that you can ensure that confidentiality is as protected as possible, given the setting. if there's one thing that I hope you take away from listening to this, it's that you already have the skills needed to do this work. It can sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, be really intimidating or really scary to work with incarcerated survivors if you've never done it before, in particular, because you're maybe worried that you don't know what you're talking about, or that you may not be able to offer the kind of help that they need. And you most certainly can, just based on the knowledge and the skills that you have from working with community survivors. However, there are going to be some things that are going to be different, right? Some things that you may use in the community that you can't use in detention settings. So it'll be important, particularly when you're talking about coping skills and ways to cope and to heal, that you are, keeping in mind some of the limitations that incarcerated survivors are going to have, right? So for example, going out on a walk, taking a bath, listening to your favorite music, these kinds of, coping strategies that we might recommend to someone in the community aren't necessarily going to be appropriate inside, right? So it's important to just, have some coping skills at the ready that are going to be applicable to almost anybody, right? So that might include progressive muscle relaxation, mindfulness exercises, journaling is another really good one, particularly if survivors don't feel safe talking to a lot of people or even to you. Journaling is another really good option. Asking them what they have access to and what they don't, asking them what they do when they're stressed out about other things, making it a conversation, and trusting that survivor's expertise on their own experience really helps in this arena as well. Similarly, if you are providing resources or referrals, and this could be like written materials or, anything like that, you want to make sure that you've done a little bit of research and that you've made any edits to those resources so that they're appropriate for incarcerated survivors, and so that you're not providing any false hope, right? So there's a lot of organizations out there that do good work, but don't respond to incarcerated survivors quickly or at all, right? And we don't want to add to that frustration or cost them yet another stamp, to write to an organization that's not going to write them back, right? So if you're going to provide a referral to an organization, talk to that organization and ask them, what do you do if you get a letter from someone, right? So that you can give that survivor sort of an idea of what to expect, right? There are a lot of really good organizations out there that do work with detention facilities nationally. And there are probably really good organizations in your area that do work inside detention facilities as well. So partnering with them, sharing resources with those entities can be really, really helpful. As I mentioned earlier, we will be doing a couple trainings in September on building relationships and going to some more detail about best practices for doing different kinds of services. We hope to see you then. You're either going to see myself again, or my colleague Chris Mady, or my other colleague Yamila Cervantes. And we're really looking forward to being able to talk with you all live and get some interaction, and just being able to support you all so that you can support others. There are some resources that the links are here. You should be getting a copy of these slides as well, so you can just click on the links right there. We have a website, we have a page on our website for service provider resources. We also have a resource guide for survivors that's divided by state. And then, of course, a copy of the PREA standards themselves. It can be helpful just to take a look at those, and in particular, the ones that are really relevant to your work as advocates. Again, I want to thank you so much for listening, and look forward to working with you all again in September. Take care.